You got to have character in leadership. On the one hand, on the other hand, I'm kind of a character. When looking for key talent, especially as it pertains to character, is the organizations often forget to drop back and ask each other and make sure they have a clear understanding of what are the dogma things about character that we cannot budge on.
William Vanderbloemen, founder and CEO of Vanderbloemen Search Group, has combined his experience as a pastor, working in HR, and running his executive search firm to speak uniquely into identifying when leaders are ready to lead again. Well, what do we mean by that? William shares what he picks up on while interviewing potential pastors over all these years, and how a restored and redeemed life of character is a powerful tool God uses today.
When somebody describes a failure or a lapse in judgment or a time that was really rough, are they speaking as a victor or a victim? Or put more plainly, what part of the mistake are they owning right out of the gate?
Hey, William Vanderbloemen, welcome back to the ECFA podcast. It's so good to have you.
Great to be here, Michael. Been a long time fan of your work, and I don't know if I've ever seen a time where it's more needed than now. So glad to be here and help however I can.
Well, thank you. Hey, appreciate that. And yeah, we feel the same way so much about the work that you do. And, we were having conversation recently, William, just about the importance of, you spoke to the need now more than ever, but about, issues like integrity in leadership, healthy leadership, the importance of that. That's been a real focus for us lately here at ECFA and on the podcast, and, had lots of great conversations. We want to make sure your perspective's part of that, because I know in the work that you do, working with so many churches, ministries, faith-based organizations, in the process of finding the right leaders, these kinds of issues around leadership integrity, they're so fundamental, right?
Absolutely. And I think what I'm learning, Michael, now, your work and mine might diverge a little bit. Like, if you've got a CFO who embezzles, well, they don't need to be the CFO anymore, right? Or if you've got somebody who's misleading donors, they probably don't need to be leading donors. What I'm finding is really interesting to me is trying to figure out, okay, the older I get, the more I realize I make a lot of mistakes. And so the question I'm trying to unearth as we interview candidates, churches, ministries, schools, hire us to find their top staff. How do I figure out if somebody's recovered from a failure? And so that's been a pretty cool little research project we've done. But in no way do I want to come off as like the expert in integrity. I am over in a glass house within a glass subdivision.
Yes.
not throwing any rocks at all. It's interesting. Sorry to go on and on. I'm a recovering preacher. So I blab. But I'm fascinated. If you look and you study Paul's writings that built most of the New Testament, one class I took at Princeton and in seminary was on Galatians, and there are a couple different schools of thought, but most of the scholars I tend to agree with think that Galatians is probably one of Paul's earliest letters. Okay, so how does Paul start Galatians? Paul, an apostle, called by God, not by man. And okay, that's pretty cool. No self-esteem issues. That's right on, You get to the end of Paul's life, one of his latest letters, he says, I am the chief of all sinners.
Changing tone. Yeah.
Well, changing tone. So did he screw up? Did he move backwards in life? No, actually, I think the walk and process of becoming like Jesus, the sanctification process, is more and more an awareness of just what he did on the cross and just how badly I need his grace. So I don't want to, anytime I enter a conversation about integrity, I want to make sure people understand I'm leading as, I might beat Paul as chief of all sinners, And it's for me, it's more a question of how do we show if somebody's recovered from that? How do we keep things from happening in a repeated fashion? And that's like I say, some of that's not germane to your work. You get somebody that draws what we would call in the office a red card. Yeah, that's not going to work. But yeah, that may not be where you wanted to go with that question, but it's super interesting to see what Jesus does to help people become forgiven sinners.
Oh, no doubt about that. I mean, and yeah, we've had some great conversations with others just around that idea of, yeah, we totally want to approach this topic from a spirit of humility and recognizing, I mean, not to repeat necessarily past conversations, but I mean, there's so many unique burdens that leaders bear and like the responsibilities and just all of those things. But I think that that's so key into taking into account, I think, where we both share that same heart and that same spirit is, hey, what can we do as a community to be able to come alongside leaders, to be proactive, to help provide a level of care and support for their integrity? Because the truth is, like, we need each other. So yeah, I know that you see the importance of that as well. So what would you say, William, because maybe the best place to start is sort of at the beginning, and you work with so many organizations in the process of helping to identify and find, the right fit, the right leader for a season. So why is it critical? I mean, boards and others that are responsible for a search, I mean, they're looking at all the competencies and skills to fill a position, but I think we don't overlook the importance, right, of character and integrity and even the beginning process. So speak to why that's so important from your experience.
Yeah, well, it's an old adage. Most of your listeners have probably heard it before, but you look for 3 or 4 C's when you're hiring: character, competency, chemistry. Some people would say cultural fit. But that's an old adage, and there's a reason it's been repeated, because it bears repeating. And you got to have character in leadership. On the one hand, on the other hand, I'm kind of a character. So, and you are too.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you measure whether or not a person falls within the boundaries of what I would call mandatory character, strongly desired character, and then, oh, that'd be really great if they also had this. It's like must agree, really would like you to agree, sort of agree, or doctrinally, the dogma, the center things we cannot disagree about, the key doctrine, the things that we probably need to be agreeing about, and then the adiaphora, the things that it doesn't really matter whether we agree or not. And I think for organizations, the key that I think is often overlooked when looking for key talent, especially as it pertains to character, is the organizations often forget to drop back and ask each other and make sure they have a clear understanding of what are the dogma things about character that we cannot budge on. And no matter how much we like them and how much Jesus has forgiven them and all that, like, that just isn't going to work. That's usually a short list. I think it should be a short list. And that's where you guys are so great. I mean, people have to go through a long process to be accredited, to keep that sort of, sorry if this is the wrong analogy, but good housekeeping seal of approval. Like,
Sure.
That,
Yep.
So if organizations could get clear on what are the things that we really have to have present. For instance, we've got one client that for them, they don't want employees that carry a lot of debt. Doesn't matter if they, are paying on time, doesn't matter if they do a good job, but for this particular client, which is a very, very large church, they've just gotten burned a bunch of times on people who are in debt, tend to be distracted. They tend to not be able to give full attention. You can't ever really pay them enough because they're always, out spending what they're earning. And for them, that is a dogma issue. Like, they also are a group of people who are like, hey, if there's been an inappropriate relationship, in the past, show me you've recovered, and we can talk. Well, I've got other clients, they're just as smart, who would be just the opposite. You'd be like, no, inappropriate relationship, that's it. You're disqualified from ministry forever. And these are smart people too, so it's not right or wrong. But debt, if you're managing it, if it's so you could go to seminary, then we're okay. I don't think enough organizations sit down and ask the hard question of what are the things that would draw, my son plays soccer, what would draw a red card? You're out. Sorry. And what would draw a yellow card? And if you do another yellow card, it turns into where are those lines? And I think the clearer an organization can be about what works for them in character and what's workable, what's mandatory and what's strongly desired, the easier it's going to be to interview for character. Because if you're looking for perfect, you're not going to find it.
100%. Yeah, no, I like that. I appreciate how, you sort of flip that in a way of a lot of times people are thinking, okay, what are those questions that we need to ask of the person? But there's a lot of wisdom, William, in what you just said, which is it really needs to start with what are some questions we need to ask ourselves first before we then go, and ask some of those questions. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And then how about getting back to that idea a little bit too? Let's say once an organization is really clear, about what are those non-negotiables, what is essential. How do you find a way in a search process or in a discernment process of bringing in a leader to really ask what could be some of those awkward questions? How do you do that?
Well, that's easy, Michael. You hire a search firm.
There you go. Without giving away the secret sauce,
Yeah. No, I actually, so this will sound salesy, but there is some value in having a third party ask those questions because they can't ever get unasked. It's like the old children's lesson image of the tube of toothpaste. Once you squeeze it out, it ain't going back in. And so whoever asks it is kind of the hammer. And, so I would start with who should ask those questions, right? And it might be the person who's going to be the direct supervisor because you're an organization that we ask hard questions. We tell the last 10% of the truth. We come at it hard and fast. That's fine if that's who you are. But if you're a conflict avoidant, maybe it needs to be a board member, maybe it needs to be a search consultant. But think about who is going to ask this question because it will leave a mark on the relationship. And it can be a good mark, but it's going to leave a mark. So assess that first, okay? And then once you figured out who is going to ask these questions and you know what you're trying to unearth, what's the mandatory that we must, I used to say, I was so bad, Michael, when I first started. I think you've heard me say this before, but, clients hire us to do a search. And when we take them a finalist, I just don't need any surprises, And so it's I'd try and I was much closer to when I was a preacher at the time. So I still had a little bit more preacher voice. And I'd say, before we end the interview, I need to know, are there any moral failures in your past? Trying to get to skeleton in the closet, surprise kind of thing. And I think what I've learned is I sounded like an idiot. And you don't have to say it that way for smart people to answer. So, and I realized this when I was interviewing a guy. I say he's a guy who's just almost a kid. He was probably 23 or 4 for a student ministry position. And I said, Michael, are there any moral failures in your past? And he just paused. And then he looked at me and he said, Mr. Vanderbloemen, I am a moral failure.
Yeah.
Oh,
right.
Thought, okay, so much for the Princeton seminary education. I just got schooled by the 23-year-old who didn't go to seminary.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So I think what I've learned to ask is a little softer tone, clear, but a softer tone, because here's the thing. If a person can't recognize what you're asking, that's a problem. And what I've learned to do is couch things in terms of, hey, look, I'm so amazed at how much people can forgive. I mean, it's why we're in this business, right? We believe that dead people can walk, that sinners can be forgiven, that blind people can see. What I have found is hard is when we get caught with surprises. So I want to give you a chance right now to clear the air of any surprises that might come up later that would be a real embarrassment to you or to our organization if they should come out later.
I like that.
That's usually pretty good for people to say, well, I went bankrupt at one point. Or, for the people who are in their mid-40s who went to college right when the internet was, hitting full throttle and hormonal boys were looking things on the internet they shouldn't have. Like, that's pretty widespread problem. The world of things you shouldn't look at in the hands of a 19-year-old, like that can come out. So are there any surprises, right? Now, if you can get past that, like the core issues, the red cards, the dogma, what I find super interesting is to give people a chance to talk about recovery. And what I mean when I say that is, hey, look, I make mistakes all the time. Sometimes they're big, sometimes they're little. Think back for me. Now, listen carefully when I say this. Think back with me about a time you made a pretty big error in judgment. And walk me through what happened and what happened afterward. Now, if you listened, I said a pretty big error in judgment. I'm learning over the years that if you ask superlative questions, it paralyzes candidates. Michael, what's the single most significant accomplishment of your life? Well, that's accepting Jesus into my heart, marrying my wife. Like, that's not what you're really asking, is it? You want to know, tell me a time that you did something, you felt really good about your work, like God used you and you did an amazing thing. Same with failures. What's the single biggest failure in your life? Now, tell me about it. You've already cleared the deck as best you can tell about the dogma, like no surprises are coming. Tell me about a time that was what you would call a pretty significant error in judgment and what happened then and what happened afterward. Because then I think that you can start to see a level of self-awareness in the candidate or a lack of it. And most people don't have it. And you can hear whether or not they have found a path to healing whatever caused the error in judgment. Because if you find somebody who found like a path toward healing, like Paul might say, well, one error in judgment, let's see, I helped stone Stephen. That was pretty dumb. But here's what happened. I met Jesus on a road. He turned my life around. I was blind for 3 days. I got under the covering of the apostles. So letting people talk about where they foresee an error in judgment reveals a lot. If they say, well, I've just been really fortunate. I haven't had any real big errors in judgment. Then you end the interview and you walk away and you go find another candidate. Because that's such a big blind spot. It'll hurt you eventually. So those two things. It's once you're clear as an organization on what is absolutely uncompromisable on our part. And I mean like really uncompromisable. Everybody said, well, they must be, and it's 500 things. No, like if this happened, they would get fired today. And then what is, they made a mistake, but they came back and hear about the comeback. And there's some really concrete pieces of evidence that we've learned to look for when asking and letting a candidate self-describe what they've done after an error in judgment. And there are about 7 of them. And we've come to these through interviewing 30,000 people. We've come to it through talking to counselors and therapists, psychiatrists. Say, here's evidence of real healing and the person ready to go again. But that may be a whole nother podcast.
No, hey, that's so good. Just taking in a lot of what you just shared. I think too, something else that comes to mind for me is yeah, the importance of that conversation sort of right up front in the selection process. But then, yeah, the reality is, someone comes on the team, life happens, we all continue to be human, just all of those things. How do organizations, in recognizing that reality and wanting to provide a level of care and support for a leader's integrity, like how do we continue to create a safe space for that kind of conversation to continue beyond just the initial interview process? Like if you're a board with, a level of oversight, ultimately say over the CEO or senior pastor, whether it's that board or there's some other group that has that responsibility, like how do we continue to have that conversation and create a safe space?
Well, that's such a good question. I find that far too often boards assume that everybody knows the rules. Like, how often are you as a board reiterating what's important to us and what's not? Like, hey, guys, we pay money every year to be a member of ECFA. We go through a process to do that. And it's because we have this incredibly clear conviction that we need to be above reproach with how we deal with our finances. So just so we're all clear, if you're not above reproach for it, you're out of line with us. A severe example that doesn't have to do with finances. My friend and client, Dave Ramsey, one of his things is gossip. Like he's just like not going to have it in the office. And for a long time, it was, no strikes and you're out, or one strike and you're out. You gossip, you're fired. Doesn't matter where you are on the org chart. He's backed off that a little bit. I think he's got like a one warning rule now or something or another. Well, how do you do that? Well, you start by keeping it really clear and consistently communicated to people. Make sure people know where the fence posts are of behavior that's allowable and not, so that when you have to say, sorry, dude, you just drew the red card, it's not a surprise. Second piece would be, how are you providing safe spaces for conversation? And that might not even be with the board members. It might be, are you providing options for counseling for your people so they can go, if you're starting to feel like there might be an issue, how are you communicating to your employees that someone who's starting to feel that way has a safe place to go talk? And I think more than anything that I've seen, Michael, with boards communicating with senior pastors is, tell me who your 2 a.m. friends are. What does that mean? What does that mean? Your 2 a.m. friend is the one that you can call at 2 a.m. and they will come get you out of jail without asking any questions, and then once it's no longer 2 a.m., they're going to look at you and say, what were you thinking and how do we keep this from happening again? I think men are particularly bad at finding those relationships. Took me a long time to figure that out. And I've got some good ones. In fact, one that heard me give this talk one time raised his hand in the Q&A after, and he said, just so you guys know, I'm William's 4 a.m. friend, and I bring a shovel. So
it gets worse after 2. Yeah.
But I mean, really, like you show me a leader who has fallen. I'll show you one who doesn't have close friends and or is really tired. Straight line back to a fallen leader is a tired leader, overworked leader, burned out leader. So are you creating places for a person to have a city of refuge, like a counseling option, regular sabbatical that's kind of forced? And are you making sure that you don't have to micromanage it, but that you as a board member are ensuring that your pastor or leader has really close friends of the same gender that they can take the hard things to? And at the end of the day, Michael, you know what I can't not figure out how to do? I can't keep liars from lying.
Yeah.
It just happens. I mean, coming from the chief of all sinners, sometimes you just get deceived, and you've got to have stopgaps in place like ECFA standards that prevent one person from having all the control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's good. And, yeah, you make a good point that that will, you can't prevent that. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that organizations that are surrounding a leader shouldn't step up and be willing to engage in this way or ask some of these questions. Because I don't know if that's been your experience, but I'd say in what we've seen, there's far too few that are either willing or ready to be able to ask these kinds of questions. So I think it's a good challenge that you raise.
Well, and it's, the whole board composition thing is such a difficult dance. You can have a rotation of new leaders, and then they don't have the relational equity to ask those questions. Or you could have leaders that have known the pastor forever and ever and ever, and the backside of that is sometimes it turns into a bit of a old boys network, or we let pastor do whatever you want. I don't know how you strike the balance between those two. I don't know that anyone's figured out the singular answer for that.
Yeah, no, that's right. But definitely some good considerations. I wanted to pick back up on something too that you've mentioned a couple times already in our conversation, which sounds like you're doing some work around studying. Did you mention some recovering leaders or those that have perhaps been through some things? And maybe you've learned from them. Just kind of an open opportunity to talk about what you're learning.
Yeah, well, we're actually going to have we're putting finishing touches on it, but 7 pieces of evidence that show someone has recovered from a fall, and I can run through 1 or 2 of them with you now, and then sooner or later we'll have the white paper out and come back on and do a longer conversation.
All 7. Yep.
Yeah, one for sure is when a person can bring up their mistake without me having to dig it out of them. Usually, if you're having to have the conversation, look, now, I mean, really, think hard. Is there anything that you haven't told us that would embarrass you? You have to go is there a moral failure? But if the person, when you say, tell me about a lapse in judgment, and they go pretty deep, pretty fast, that's a pretty good sign that they've recovered. They don't have to tell you everything, and you don't want somebody who's a walking damaged good, but if they bring it up in the right context on their own, that's a pretty good sign. Second thing is, and this one is so rare, Michael, but when somebody describes a failure or a lapse in judgment or a time that was really rough, are they speaking as a victor or a victim? Or put more plainly, what part of the mistake are they owning right out of the gate, and what portion of the conversation is about what happened to them? It could be something as victim driven as, well, there was a group of people at that church that were out to get me, and it didn't matter what I did, I was just always doing wrong in their eyes. And that does happen, right? That does happen. But if that's your explanation of where you messed up, that's not cool. The more nuanced version might be, well, I did make a mistake. Now, it was 2020. We were in a shutdown. I couldn't go outside. I couldn't see my parishioners. It was 2020 and I got in a really bad space mentally. I should have taken care of myself better. But then I got tired and I got worn out. So you hear the difference in the language? So it could be as subtle as just a little bit of ownership in a really hard time, or those people were out to get me and they did that and they that and they. I went through a divorce a million years ago, which I would not recommend, by the way. It wasn't exciting enough for tabloids to pick it up, but I remember my counselor saying to me, William, no one ever heals from divorce until they figure out what part of the divorce was their fault. And he said, because I've never seen a one-sided divorce, ever. And that just stuck with me. And I don't know, they're like, there's probably somebody listening today who was beaten, and they're like, that wasn't my fault. I get it, but please hear this in the spirit I'm trying to deliver it. And that is, man, I'm just learning as I get older, I got to work on getting the log out of my eye before ever talking about the splinter somewhere else. And if you want to find evidence that someone's healed from a hard time, it's when they lead with ownership. It's so rare, Michael. I mean, like, think back to the first human mistake. That's a pretty big one, original sin, right?
Yeah, that's right.
God shows up in the cool of the day, and I think it's kind of funny. Somebody gave us a number of years ago a fig tree to keep inside. So I've never even been around a fig tree, but like fig leaves are the most ridiculous excuse for a covering. They're scratchy. They get hard real fast. They're brittle, and they look dumb. And God's walking through the garden. He comes across Adam and Eve looking like idiots, dressed up, and he's just shaking his head like, "So, Adam, what have you done? Did you eat from the tree?" You remember the answer? Yeah, the answer was, the woman, the one you gave me, made me do it. Like, that is our default. Yeah. And then, of course, Eve said, well, the snake made me do it. Like, pass the buck. If you meet somebody who owns what was their fault, what was their problem, and leads with that, I think you found someone pretty far down the road of healing. So that's two. Are they bringing it up on their own, or are you having to dig it out of them? And do they own their part? Or are they talking about why other people contributed to reasons that this happened to them in a passive voice? That's a couple off the top.
Yeah. No, I think that's, there's so much wisdom in that. And that helps folks a lot just in the discernment process. Because again, it comes back to something you said earlier too, which is all human, none of us perfect. We all walk through, these kinds of things, but it is all in sort of how we pick up and move on. And then for organizations as they're looking to be able to use tools like these, in the discernment process, I think that's huge. I think another one too, this touches a little bit on something that you are a theme, I think, that's in a lot of what you're sharing too, William, which is authenticity. And that's a huge, I think, value, especially to rising generation of not just leaders, but I think the world around us and, ECFA, the way we articulate our mission is enhancing trust, and so in the watching world, I think authenticity today is just so huge. And I'm hearing that theme in a number of the different comments that you're making about leaders who are in a healthy place. There seems to be some connection here to the authenticity of the leader.
Absolutely. And newsflash, I'm sure you guys realized this before I did. There are no more fig leaves. You can't hide everything. You know how glad I am that my sermons are not digitized?
Oh, tell me about it.
I would never make it now. And even that, there's just no privacy anywhere. And so what it used to be, integrity is who you are when no one else is looking. Well, everyone's looking all the time now. So it's kind of over. So you might as well just be who you are and be authentic. I think I might put one distinction out there, though, Michael, and it hits on a third of these 7 pieces of evidence. And that is, does a person view authenticity as telling you how much pain there's been in their life, how bad things have been, how much shame they have? Let me walk that out a little bit. There's a saying. One of these pieces of evidence is: did the person's failure become something they recovered from, or is it their defining mark? So we had one guy who, looked at porn on the internet when he was in Bible college, and he got some really great healing from it. And his wife will be the first person to tell you how he's all recovered, and that's great. But then we went to look at his teaching, and every single talk that he did was on internet porn. It's like, okay, there's authenticity, and then there's, I don't think you're over this yet. And turns out, sure enough, he wasn't. But there's a saying in Alcoholics Anonymous: there's nothing more wearisome than hearing a recovering alcoholic talk about how drunk they used to be. So I think I'm all for authenticity, but if that means, let me show you how weak I am. Let me show you how hurt I've become. Let me tell you about that time I messed up over and over and over and over and over. I think it's such a fine line that only wisdom can bring between being authentic and not trying to show the big, strong, proud man, never let him see you sweat, and being a victim. So, yes, authenticity, as long as it's cloaked in some joy around the gospel, and that the good news wins, and that my sins are forgiven. And that may sound like rambling. I probably ought to write a paper on it to get thought through better. But there's just authenticity, totally 100% agree. I do see some people that mistake whininess for authenticity. How's that?
Yeah. That's true. That's a different, it's like when you look up a synonym and they give you like 30 different options or something. Yeah, there you go. Sometimes you got to parse out which synonym are we talking about. I think that's good.
Right.
Yeah. Hey, I want to ask you in a second just about maybe some success stories or like leaders that you've seen sort of run that race well and the impact that has on an organization and a culture. From an integrity standpoint and healthy leadership. Before we go there, I was going to mention too, just for those that are either listening or watching this podcast, that so many of the great nuggets of wisdom here that William has shared, they were recently even part of a joint effort that we were part of with David Fletcher, an ex-pastor, the Strengthening Integrity Workshop. So if you like what you hear, I know those resources are available for free replay. I'd encourage you to check it out. So, William, that's my unsolicited plug for you there. It's worth people tuning in. But let's shift to some of those success stories, or just as you think of, because I'm sure you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. We've kind of talked maybe a little bit more about some of the bad and the ugly or how to prevent it. But what do you also see just from casting a vision for the integrity and leadership that none of us are perfect, but striving for? What kind of impact does that have on an organization and a culture?
Well, I think anytime somebody can show recovery, it gives a tremendous hope to the organization, and it broadcasts authenticity. I don't have it all together, but I'm learning. Paul saying he's the chief of all sinners. That gives hope to the church at Rome. So I would say, if you've gotten in a tough spot, don't think you have ruined your life and your ministry. I mean, I'll be the first to tell you, if you've still got a breath, God's not done yet. And if you can somehow ask Jesus to show you, like, what do you want me to learn from this? Where should I have been more aligned with you than I was? And start to do the hard work of recovery. I think you'll be amazed. You'll probably do more in the future than you ever did in the past. So when I see leaders who really have made the comeback, and I've seen some pretty bad slip-ups that have still turned into good stories. Might not be the same story, right? But great stories of hope. I too often the world wants to tell you you're done. You don't have anything left in you. You screwed up too bad. No. The way I read it, God's forgiveness stretches as far as the east is from the west, and I don't have the ability to sin that hard. So just a word of encouragement to people out there. You can come back. It might take a long, hard time, but you can, and you can bring hope to organizations. And I've even seen it become the signature of organizations. I know a number of, I won't out people, but a number of clients we've had where the leader was very much their sort of signature message was what you're not supposed to be. We're not this, we're not, it's the, you ever hear of salvation by subtraction? I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't cuss, I don't dance, so I must be going to heaven. Like, it's not, that was their signature. And then life happens to them and they screw up. And then Jesus redeems, restores, and renews. And all of a sudden they're preaching a gospel of hope that I'm like, wow, what happened to this guy? It's about hope, not cheap grace, but hope. So I think people underestimate God's ability to draw a straight line with a crooked stick. And, doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to the rules, doesn't mean people shouldn't have high standards, but just don't underestimate how much my friend just across the way here, now I'm going to get in trouble. My friend at Lakewood, Joel, says, your setback might be God's setup for the greatest comeback.
Yes.
I just encourage people that we are with a God of second chances and 7 times 70 chances.
There you go. I think that's the gospel right there. And I think of, just so many of the, like, let it not be lost on us that so many of the just heroes of the faith that we look to. I mean, the leaders of leaders that we look to in scripture, it's like none of them are perfect or didn't have their marks. It was how God used that when those people would submit, what they had experienced and walked through, and there had to be a level of humility and obedience. But yes, God is a redeeming God. He uses those things. So I think you're not just a recovering preacher. I think you still got it. So that's good. Well, William, I so appreciate this time with you. Good insights as always. And I don't know if you have a time out on this, but yeah, we'd love to have you back when you do share the full, hey, here's the 7. But in the meantime, for those that are listening and watching, how do they stay in touch with you? How can they be on the lookout for that resource?
Well, I hated my last name until Google was invented, because it turned the search engine guys tell me, your last name is so messed up, William. People can misspell it about 100 different ways, and they'll still get to your website. So just put Vanderbloemen, however you want to spell it, into Google. You'll end up on our page. And one of the things we've tried to do for the last 15 years is create free resources for leaders. So no strings attached. It's mainly stuff that I wish I had learned in seminary and never did. And I think you'll find some pretty cool things there. And one in particular that comes to mind with your clients is, one of the most awkward board conversations that I know, and one that can go sideways real fast, is how much should we pay the pastor? And I mean, we want to be responsible. We also don't want to lose our pastor. So you'll find a ton of advice on compensation there. And, if you ever need a study done, we do that kind of thing for a whole lot of people. So sorry for the shameless plug there, but I think that might be helpful.
No, there you go. Vanderbloemen.com. You'll get there.
William,
get there. Hey, great to be with you as always. Keep up the great work, my friend.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for all you're doing for Team Jesus.
All right. It's a pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Well, we can't thank you enough for listening to ECFA's Behind the Seal podcast. Now, I wouldn't define character as subjective, but I love the wisdom that William shared, and it's wildly accurate that different organizations have different character dogmas. Have you ever considered what your own character dogmas might be, whether the other top leaders and the board of your organization share the same? It's something interesting to consider and to flesh out a little bit. Hey, we would love for you to share this episode with your coworkers and ministry partners. Hey, see you next time. Take care.